The eviction notice crumpled in her trembling hands as 22-year-old Sophia Rivers stood outside the glass doors of Manhattan's most exclusive private members club, the Sterling Reserve. Inside, she could see men in $1,000 suits discussing deals over vintage scotch, while their wives displayed jewelry worth more than most people's annual salaries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to beg these same people for enough money to keep a roof over her head, clutching her violin case like a lifeline in the bitter February wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years ago, Sophia had been the rising star of Juilliard's violin program, her professors calling her a once-in-a-generation talent. She had been featured in the school's promotional materials, performed solo with the New York Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, and had her pick of prestigious summer festivals. Then her world collapsed in a single phone call. Her younger brother Marcus had been diagnosed with acute leukemia, and her mother could barely afford the treatments, even with insurance. Sophia made the hardest decision of her life, dropping out of Juilliard in her final year to work 3 jobs and help support her family financially. The past 3 years had been a blur of exhaustion and sacrifice. She worked as a barista at dawn, taught elementary school music classes during the day, and waited tables at night. Every spare dollar went toward Marcus's medical bills, leaving nothing for her own dreams. She hadn't touched her violin seriously in months, her calloused fingers now more familiar with coffee machines and serving trays than delicate strings. But Marcus was getting better. The treatments were working, and her family was finally seeing light at the end of the tunnel. However, Sophia's own tunnel seemed to be collapsing. Her landlord had sold the building, and the new owners wanted everyone out within 30 days. Her 3 jobs barely covered her current expenses, and finding a new apartment in New York City required first month's rent. Last month's rent, security deposit, and broker fees that totaled more than she could earn in 6 months. She had tried everything. Banks wouldn't give her a loan without collateral. Her credit was shot from the medical bills. Friends from Juilliard had moved on with their lives, landing positions with orchestras or wealthy patrons, living in a world that now felt impossibly distant from her reality. She had even swallowed her pride and reached out to her former professors, but they had filled her spot with another promising student and moved forward without looking back. Sophia adjusted her worn peacoat and studied the imposing entrance of the Sterling Reserve. She had heard whispers that wealthy members sometimes hosted private events and hired musicians for entertainment. It was a long shot, but she was running out of options. The eviction notice gave her exactly 7 days to come up with $3,000, and her violin was the only skill she possessed that might command that kind of money quickly. The doorman, an older gentleman with silver hair and a perfectly pressed uniform, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain as she approached. His nameplate read Harrison, and his expression suggested he had perfected the art of keeping undesirable people away from his establishment's pristine marble floors. "Excuse me," Sophia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was wondering if I could speak to someone about performing opportunities. I'm a classically trained violinist, and I understand that members sometimes host private events that require musical entertainment." Harrison's eyebrows rose, as if she had just asked to perform surgery in the lobby. "Miss, this is a private club. We don't have street musicians here." "I'm not a street musician," Sophia replied, lifting her violin case slightly. "I have formal training from Juilliard. I just need to speak with someone about—" "Juilliard?" Harrison interrupted with a short laugh. "And I suppose you're going to tell me you're some kind of prodigy who's fallen on hard times. Do you have any idea how many people come here with sob stories and claims about their prestigious backgrounds?" Heat rose in Sophia's cheeks, but desperation kept her rooted to the spot. "I can prove it. If someone would just listen to me play for 5 minutes, that's quite enough," Harrison said, stepping closer to the door as if to block her entry. Miss, I'm sure you're very talented, but the Sterling Reserve maintains certain standards. Our members expect a particular level of refinement. Perhaps you should try the subway stations or Washington Square Park. I hear street performing can be quite lucrative. His words stung more than Sophia had expected. She had spent years among the elite of the classical music world, had performed for audiences who understood the difference between technique and artistry, had been praised by professors who had trained at the world's finest conservatories. Now she was being dismissed as a common busker by a doorman who probably couldn't tell a Stradivarius from a student violin. "Please," she said, hating the desperation she could hear creeping into her voice. "I just need one chance. I can play for any member who might be interested. I'm not asking for charity, just an opportunity to earn what I need through my music." Harrison's expression softened slightly, perhaps moved by her obvious desperation, but he shook his head firmly. "Miss, I can't just let anyone walk in here and start performing. Our members pay significant dues for privacy and exclusivity. If we allowed every musician who claimed to have attended prestigious schools to perform here, we'd be no better than a subway platform." Before Sophia could respond, the heavy glass door opened, and a woman in her 60s emerged, wrapped in a luxurious fur coat despite the February warmth inside. She had been listening to their conversation through the glass, and had apparently decided to intervene. "Harrison, what's all this about?" she asked in a cultured voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Just someone looking to perform for money, Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison replied quickly. "I was explaining our policies about maintaining the club's standards." Mrs. Whitmore studied Sophia with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "And you claim to have attended Juilliard?" "I did attend Juilliard," Sophia said, meeting her gaze directly. "I was in my final year when family circumstances required me to leave. I'm not asking for charity, just a chance to demonstrate my abilities and perhaps earn enough to pay my rent." "Your rent?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. How refreshingly honest. Most people who approach our members have some elaborate story about pursuing their artistic dreams. "You simply need money for rent." "I need $3,000 in 7 days, or I'll be evicted," Sophia said, deciding that complete honesty was her only remaining strategy. "I've been working multiple jobs to support my family, but my building was sold, and I can't come up with the money needed for a new apartment. My violin is the only asset I have that might generate that kind of income quickly." Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, studying Sophia's face as if trying to read her character. "What's your name?" "Sophia Rivers." "And what did you study at Juilliard, Miss Rivers?" "Violin performance under Professor Elena Marchetti. I was specializing in both classical and contemporary repertoire, with a focus on solo performance and chamber music." Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed subtly at the mention of Professor Marchetti's name. "Elena Marchetti is a respected instructor. If she accepted you into her studio, you must have considerable talent." "She was an excellent teacher," Sophia replied carefully. "I learned a great deal during my time there." "Very well," Mrs. Whitmore said, reaching a decision. "I happen to be hosting a small dinner party this evening for 12 guests. We had arranged for a string quartet, but their cellist has fallen ill. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And they've had to cancel. If you can perform solo repertoire for approximately 2 hours, I'll pay you $1,500. Sophia's heart leaped. It wasn't the full amount she needed, but it was half of her goal and more money than she had made in any single day since leaving school. "That would be wonderful. What type of repertoire would you prefer?" "Something elegant but not intrusive. My guests will want to converse during dinner, so nothing too dramatic or attention-grabbing. Can you handle that kind of background performance?" It wasn't the kind of playing Sophia had trained for at Juilliard, where every note was meant to command complete attention, but she nodded eagerly. "Of course, I can prepare appropriate selections." "Excellent. The event begins at 7:30. Arrive at 7 for a brief sound check. Harrison will give you the details. Mrs. Whitmore started toward the street, then turned back. Miss Rivers, I hope you understand that this is a trial. If your performance meets our standards, there may be future opportunities. If not, she didn't need to finish the sentence. After Mrs. Whitmore departed in a sleek black town car, Harrison's demeanor toward Sophia changed noticeably. He was still formal and somewhat cold, but he no longer treated her like a potential criminal trying to infiltrate his sacred space. Mrs. Whitmore is one of our most influential members, he explained, as he wrote down the evening's details on club stationery. Her husband founded Whitmore Industries, and she sits on the boards of several major cultural institutions. If she's satisfied with your performance, word will spread quickly among the membership. I understand, Sophia said, accepting the paper with the club's address and specific instructions for the service entrance she should use that evening. I won't disappoint her. I see that you don't, Harrison replied, but his tone was more cautionary than hostile now. These people have very high standards and little patience for mediocrity. They've heard the best musicians in the world perform in the finest venues. If you claim to have Juilliard training, you'll need to prove it. As Sophia walked away from the Sterling Reserve, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had 6 hours to prepare for the most important performance of her life, playing repertoire she hadn't touched in months for an audience that expected perfection. Her violin case suddenly felt heavier, weighted with both opportunity and the pressure of her desperate circumstances. She spent the afternoon in her tiny studio apartment, practicing scales and arpeggios until her fingers remembered their old agility. Her violin, a decent German instrument she had purchased in her first year at Juilliard, felt foreign under her chin after months of neglect. The calluses from her restaurant work had softened the fingertips she had once kept carefully maintained, and her bow technique felt rusty and uncertain. But slowly, as the hours passed, muscle memory began to reassert itself. The elegant phrases of Mozart's violin sonatas flowed more smoothly. Bach's technical passages started to feel manageable again. By the time she needed to leave for the club, Sophia felt cautiously optimistic about her ability to deliver a competent performance. She changed into her only formal dress, a simple black number she had worn to Juilliard recitals 3 years ago. It was slightly loose now, her body having changed from the physical demands of her multiple jobs, but it was appropriate for the evening's requirements. She carefully packed her violin and music stand, along with sheet music for a variety of pieces that would provide elegant background ambiance without overpowering conversation. The service entrance of the Sterling Reserve was located in a narrow alley behind the main building, away from the imposing front doors where she had first encountered Harrison. A different employee, a young woman in a simple black uniform, directed Sophia through a maze of service corridors to a small private dining room where Mrs. Whitmore was overseeing final preparations for her dinner party. The room was exquisitely appointed, with crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that looked like museum pieces, and a table set with china and silver that probably cost more than Sophia's annual income. Mrs. Whitmore moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had been entertaining in such settings for decades, adjusting flower arrangements and consulting with the catering staff about wine pairings. Miss Rivers, she said when she noticed Sophia's arrival. Right on time. You may set up in that corner near the window. The acoustics should be adequate, and you'll be visible without being intrusive. Sophia quickly assembled her music stand and tuned her violin, testing the room's acoustics with a few scales. The space was live, but not overly reverberant, suitable for intimate chamber music performance. She arranged her sheet music and prepared to begin, with some gentle Bach arrangements that would provide sophisticated background atmosphere. Before the guests arrive, Mrs. Whitmore said, approaching with a glass of wine in her hand, perhaps you could play something briefly so I can assess your abilities? Of course, Sophia replied, lifting her violin and considering her options. She chose the opening of Bach's air on the G string, a piece that would showcase her tone and phrasing without being overly technical or showy. as she drew the bow across the strings and the first pure notes filled the elegant room. Sophia felt a familiar sensation she had almost forgotten. The music seemed to flow directly from her heart through her fingers, bypassing conscious thought entirely. Her months away from serious playing hadn't diminished her fundamental musical instincts, only covered them with layers of exhaustion and practical concerns. Mrs. Whitmore listened intently, her expression gradually changing from polite attention to genuine interest. When Sophia finished the short excerpt, there was a moment of silence before the older woman nodded approvingly. "Very nice, Miss Rivers. You have a lovely tone and your intonation is quite good. I think you'll do very well this evening." As Mrs. Whitmore's guests began arriving, Sophia positioned herself in her designated corner and began playing soft arrangements of classical favorites. The guests, mostly couples in their 50s and 60s, dressed in evening wear that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, paid little attention to her at first, which was exactly what the situation required. She moved through her prepared repertoire steadily, mixing familiar classical pieces with some lighter contemporary arrangements that provided pleasant background atmosphere without demanding focused attention. Her technique felt increasingly secure as the evening progressed, and she began to relax into the familiar rhythm of performance. But as the dinner progressed and the wine flowed more freely, something unexpected began to happen. One of the guests, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair, began listening more intently to her playing. During a pause in the dinner conversation, he turned toward her and said, "Excuse me, young lady, but are you playing from memory?" Sophia nodded, continuing to play as she answered, "Yes, sir. I find it helps me maintain better connection with the music when I'm not reading from the page." "Remarkable," he said to his dinner companions. "She's been playing for over an hour without sheet music, and I haven't heard a single wrong note." This comment drew more attention from the other guests, who began to listen more carefully to Sophia's performance. What had started as elegant background music was gradually becoming the evening's focal point, though she continued to play at a volume that allowed for conversation. "What conservatory did you attend?" asked one of the women, an elegant lady with perfectly styled grey hair and diamonds that caught the light from the chandelier. "Juilliard," Sophia replied, transitioning smoothly into a Mozart sonata movement. "Juilliard," another guest echoed with interest. "Are you still a student there?" "No, I completed most of my degree, but had to leave before graduating," Sophia answered honestly, seeing no point in elaborating on the circumstances that had derailed her studies. The conversation at the dinner table had now shifted entirely to focus on Sophia's background and musical training. Mrs. Whitmore, who had intended for the violin to provide pleasant ambiance, found herself hosting an impromptu concert as her guests became increasingly engaged with the quality of the performance they were witnessing. "Would you mind playing something a bit more challenging?" asked the silver-haired gentleman who had first drawn attention to her playing. "I'm curious to hear what you can really do." Sophia glanced at Mrs. Whitmore, who nodded encouragingly. She considered her options and chose the opening movement of Bach's Partita No. 2, a technically demanding piece that would demonstrate both her skill and musicality without being overly flashy. As she launched into the complex polyphonic writing of the Bach, the dinner conversation ceased entirely. The guests set down their wine glasses and turned their chairs to face her, no longer pretending that she was mere background entertainment. The piece required her full concentration, with its intricate interweaving melodic lines and demanding technical passages, but Sophia felt her confidence growing with each phrase. This was the music she had lived and breathed during her years at Juilliard, the repertoire that had defined her identity as a serious classical musician. Her fingers found their old agility, her bow technique regained its precision, and her musical instincts reasserted themselves with startling clarity. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. When she finished the Bach, the silence in the room was profound. Then one guest began applauding, quickly joined by the others, until the small private dining room filled with enthusiastic appreciation. Sophia lowered her violin, surprised by the intensity of their response to what she had considered a fairly standard performance of familiar repertoire. "My dear," said Mrs. Whitmore, rising from her seat at the head of the table, "that was absolutely extraordinary. I had no idea we were in the presence of such remarkable talent." "Yeah, beautiful," agreed the silver-haired gentleman. "Simply beautiful. I've heard that piece performed many times in concert halls, but rarely with such emotional depth and technical mastery combined." Another guest, a woman who had been quietly observing throughout the evening, leaned forward in her chair. "Miss Rivers, forgive me, but I have to ask, if you have this level of ability, why aren't you performing professionally? Why are you playing private parties for rent money instead of appearing with major orchestras?" The question hit Sophia like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the gulf between her current circumstances and the musical career she had once imagined for herself. She felt her cheeks flush as she considered how to answer without revealing the full extent of her financial desperation or the sacrifices she had made for her family. "Life sometimes takes unexpected turns," she said carefully. "I've been dealing with family responsibilities that required me to step away from performing for a while." "What a tragedy," the woman continued. "Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted on background music at dinner parties. You should be on stage at Lincoln Center." Her words, though meant as a compliment, felt like salt in old wounds. Sophia had dreamed of exactly that kind of career during her years at Juilliard, had worked toward it with single-minded dedication until circumstances beyond her control had forced her to choose between her musical ambitions and her family's survival. She had made the only choice she could live with, but hearing it described as a waste of talent made her question everything she had sacrificed. "Perhaps," she said quietly, unsure how to respond to such painful accuracy. Mrs. Whitmore, sensing Sophia's discomfort, intervened smoothly. "Miss Rivers, would you be willing to play one more piece for us? Something that showcases your full abilities?" Sophia nodded, grateful for the chance to retreat into music rather than continue the uncomfortable conversation about her abandoned career. She considered her options and chose something that had special meaning for her: the opening movement of the Brahms Violin Sonata No. 1, a piece she had been working on during her final semester at Juilliard before her world had changed forever. As she began the lyrical opening theme, Sophia found herself pouring 3 years of suppressed emotion into the music. All the frustration of working jobs that barely utilized her intelligence, all the exhaustion of supporting her family while watching her dreams slip away, all the love she felt for her brother and the pride she took in helping save his life. All of it flowed through the Brahms into the elegant dining room of the Sterling Reserve. The piece built through its complex developmental sections, requiring her to navigate rapid technical passages while maintaining the emotional arc of the movement. Her years away from serious performance had not diminished her ability to communicate through music, and if anything, her life experiences had deepened her emotional connection to the repertoire she had once approached purely from an academic perspective. When she reached the movement's powerful climax, playing with an intensity that surprised even herself, she noticed that several guests had tears in their eyes. The music seemed to fill not just the room, but the very air around them, creating an atmosphere of shared emotional experience that transcended the typical boundaries between performer and audience. As the movement concluded with its gentle, reflective coda, Sophia felt a profound sense of completion, as if she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been buried under years of practical concerns and financial pressures. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but more than that, she could see in the faces of Mrs. Whitmore's guests a recognition of having witnessed something genuinely special. "Extraordinary," whispered the silver-haired gentleman. "Absolutely extraordinary." Mrs. Whitmore approached Sophia with an expression that mixed admiration with something that might have been regret. "Miss Rivers, I owe you an apology. When I hired you this evening, I thought I was getting a competent musician to provide pleasant background music. I had no idea I was inviting one of the finest violinists I've ever heard to perform in my dining room. You're very kind, Sophia replied, carefully placing her violin back in its case. The intensity of the evening's performance had left her emotionally drained, but also strangely energized, as if she had remembered who she really was, underneath the layers of compromise and survival that had defined her recent years. "I'm not being kind, I'm being honest," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Your talent is remarkable, and it's clear that you've received exceptional training. Whatever circumstances led you to step away from professional performance, I hope you'll consider returning to it soon. The world needs to hear you play." As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, several of them approached Sophia directly to express their appreciation and to ask about future performance opportunities. The silver-haired gentleman, who introduced himself as Charles Morrison, president of the Morrison Foundation, handed her his business card. "Miss Rivers, my foundation supports young classical musicians, and we're always looking for exceptional talent to sponsor. I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might interest you, if you're open to exploring a return to professional performance." Then another guest, the woman who had questioned her about her career, also offered her card. "I'm Margaret Chen, and I work with the booking department at Carnegie Hall. We have a young artist series that features emerging talent, and based on what I've heard tonight, you would be an ideal candidate." Sophia accepted their cards with growing amazement, hardly able to believe that her desperate attempt to raise rent money had somehow connected her with people who could potentially help her rebuild the musical career she had abandoned. Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party had transformed from a simple background music gig into something that felt like destiny. "Before you leave," Mrs. Whitmore said, approaching with an envelope, "here is your payment for this evening as agreed." She handed Sophia the envelope containing $1,500 in cash. "But I'd like to make you another offer. I host these intimate dinner parties once a month, and after tonight's response, I think my guests would be delighted to have you perform regularly. Would you be interested in a monthly arrangement? Same fee, similar repertoire?" Sophia's mind raced as she calculated the implications. $1,500 monthly would cover her basic living expenses and allow her to focus more time on rebuilding her musical career. It would mean she could quit at least one of her other jobs and have time to practice seriously again. That sounds wonderful," she said, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. "I'd be honored to perform for your guests regularly." "Excellent. I'll have my assistant contact you about scheduling. And Miss Rivers," Mrs. Whitmore paused, studying Sophia's face intently, "whatever brought you to my door tonight, I'm grateful for it. Your music has been a gift to all of us." As Sophia walked through the service corridors of the Sterling Reserve and back out into the February night, she felt as if she was emerging from a long, dark tunnel into unexpected sunlight. The envelope in her purse contained half the money she needed to secure her apartment, and the business cards in her pocket represented possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine when she had approached Harrison at the front door just 12 hours earlier. But more than the immediate financial relief, the evening had restored something in her that she had thought was permanently lost. For 3 years, she had defined herself primarily as Marcus's sister, as someone whose musical training was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tonight, she had remembered what it felt like to be Sophia Rivers, violinist, someone whose art could move people and create moments of shared beauty and emotion. She thought about the guests' reactions to her performance, particularly their surprise at discovering such talent in someone they had initially seen as mere hired help. It reminded her of how much she had internalized their assumptions about herself, how she had begun to think of her musical abilities as irrelevant to her current life rather than as her most valuable asset. The walk home through the quiet Manhattan streets gave her time to process what had happened and to consider what it might mean for her future. The business cards in her pocket represented opportunities that could potentially lead her back to the professional musical career she had abandoned. But pursuing them would require her to confront some difficult questions about what she really wanted from life. Did she want to return to the competitive, high-pressure world of classical performance? Could she balance a renewed focus on her music with her ongoing responsibilities to her family? Was it possible to reclaim her identity as a serious musician without abandoning the person she had become through 3 years of struggle and sacrifice? These were complex questions without easy answers, but for the first time in years, they felt like problems worth having. As she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, Sophia realized that tonight had given her something more valuable than money or professional connections. It had given her back a sense of possibility, a belief that her future could be different from her present circumstances. She carefully placed her violin case in its usual corner and sat down at her small kitchen table to examine the business cards she had collected. Charles Morrison's foundation focused on supporting classical musicians during career transitions. Margaret Chen's Carnegie Hall connection could provide performance opportunities with major professional credibility. Mrs. Whitmore's monthly dinner parties offered steady income that would allow her to rebuild her musical career gradually. Each opportunity represented a different path forward, and for the first time in 3 years, Sophia had genuine choices to make about her future rather than simply reacting to immediate crises. The eviction notice was still taped to her refrigerator, and she still needed to raise another $1,500 within the next 6 days. But tonight had proved that her musical abilities could generate significant income when presented to the right audience. More importantly, it had reminded her that she possessed something rare and valuable that no amount of financial pressure could truly take away from her. Her musical training and natural talent were assets that could not be repossessed by landlords or diminished by years of working multiple jobs. They were part of who she was at her core, and tonight had shown her that they could still open doors to opportunities she had thought were permanently closed. As she prepared for bed, Sophia found herself thinking about the moment when she had played the Brahms sonata and felt all her suppressed emotions flowing through the music. It had been cathartic in a way she hadn't expected, as if 3 years of carefully controlled feelings had finally found an outlet through the familiar language of classical repertoire. She realized that her time away from serious music, while painful, had given her something valuable that she wouldn't have possessed as a 20-year-old Juilliard student. Her life experiences had deepened her emotional connection to the music, had given her something real to express through the technical skills she had acquired during her formal training. The young violinist who had left Juilliard 3 years ago had been technically accomplished, but perhaps lacking in the life experience that could inform truly meaningful musical interpretation. The woman who had performed at Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party tonight had been shaped by struggle and sacrifice in ways that had made her art more powerful and authentic. Tomorrow, she would need to figure out how to raise the remaining money she needed for her apartment, and she would need to decide which of the opportunities presented to her tonight she wanted to pursue. But for now, she was content to sit in her small kitchen and savor the memory of rediscovering her musical identity after years of thinking it was lost forever. The evening had taught her that talent, once developed, doesn't simply disappear even when life forces it into dormancy. Her years of working multiple jobs had been about survival, but tonight had shown her that she was ready to start thinking about how to thrive again. The scared young woman who had approached the Sterling Reserve that morning, desperate for any opportunity to earn rent money, had been transformed through a single performance into someone who once again believed in her own possibilities. As she finally turned off the lights and headed toward bed, Sophia caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark window and barely recognized the person looking back at her. For the first time in 3 years, she looked like someone who had a future worth planning for, someone whose dreams were deferred rather than destroyed. Tonight had been about paying rent, but it had turned into something much more significant. A rediscovery of the artist she had never stopped being, even when circumstances had forced her to forget it temporarily. The next morning brought a harsh return to reality. Sophia woke to her alarm at 5:30, her body protesting after the emotional intensity of the previous evening's performance. She had to open the coffee shop by 6, and there was no time to luxuriate in the afterglow of her musical triumph. The business cards from Mrs. Whitmore's guests sat on her nightstand like promises from another world, but her immediate concern was getting through another day of her regular routine. The coffee shop was located in a trendy neighborhood where young professionals paid $5 for elaborate drinks with names that required explanation. Sophia had worked there for 18 months, and her manager Derek treated her like she was barely competent despite her obvious intelligence and work ethic. He was 24 years old, had dropped out of community college, and seemed to take particular pleasure in micromanaging someone he suspected was overqualified for the position. "You're 3 minutes late," Derek announced as Sophia tied her apron behind the counter. "I need you to be more reliable if you want to keep this job." Sophia bit back her response, reminding herself that she only needed to endure this for a few more hours before her shift at the elementary school began. The coffee shop job was mind-numbing but relatively easy, requiring her to memorize drink recipes and operate equipment that any reasonably intelligent person could master in a week. As she prepared the first batch of morning coffee, her mind wandered back to the previous evening. The feeling of performing serious music again, of being appreciated for her actual talents, rather than her ability to remember whether someone wanted soy milk or almond milk, seemed almost like a dream in the fluorescent lighting of the coffee shop. "Earth to Sophia," Derek called out sarcastically. "We have customers waiting." She looked up to see a line of morning commuters, all clutching their phones and radiating the impatience of people who needed caffeine before they could function properly. She fell into the familiar rhythm of taking orders, operating the espresso machine, and calling out complicated drink names, while her mind processed the implications of the connections she had made the night before. Charles Morrison's foundation could potentially provide funding for her to return to school and complete her degree. Margaret Chen's Carnegie Hall connection represented the kind of professional opportunity she had dreamed about during her student years. Mrs. Whitmore's monthly performances offered immediate income that could stabilize her financial situation, while she explored other options. But pursuing any of these opportunities would require her to make fundamental changes to her current life. She would need to reduce her work hours to have time for practice and auditions. She would need to invest in better performance attire and possibly upgrade her violin. Most importantly, she would need to shift her identity from someone who was surviving day to day to someone who was actively building toward a future. "Hey, Space Cadet," Derek's voice cut through her thoughts again. "The espresso machine isn't going to clean itself." Sophia suppressed her irritation and focused on the mechanical tasks that filled her morning. But as she worked, she found herself calculating how much money she would need to make the transition back to serious music study. The $1,500 from Mrs. Whitmore's party would cover half of her immediate housing crisis. But building a professional music career would require significantly more investment than she currently possessed. The morning rush finally subsided around 9:30, giving Sophia a brief break before she had to leave for her second job. She used the time to examine the business cards from the previous evening more carefully, reading the fine print and trying to understand exactly what each opportunity might entail. Charles Morrison's foundation apparently offered both financial assistance and career mentoring for classical musicians who were transitioning between different phases of their careers. Their website, which she browsed on her phone, featured success stories of musicians who had overcome various obstacles to achieve professional recognition. The application process appeared extensive but not prohibitive. Margaret Chen's Carnegie Hall connection was more intriguing, but also more intimidating. The Young Artist series she had mentioned featured emerging talent in solo recitals that could launch serious professional careers. The competition for these opportunities was undoubtedly fierce, and Sophia hadn't auditioned for anything significant in 3 years. Mrs. Whitmore's offer of monthly performances was the most immediately practical option, but Sophia wondered if accepting it might limit her ability to pursue other opportunities. Regular income was appealing, but she didn't want to become trapped in a comfortable arrangement that prevented her from taking bigger risks. "I need you to restock the pastry case before you leave," Derek announced, interrupting her planning session. "And make sure you rotate the older items to the front." Sophia completed her assigned tasks and gathered her things to leave for the elementary school, where she taught music classes to children aged 6 through 12. This job was more personally satisfying than the coffee shop, as it allowed her to use some of her musical knowledge, but the pay was minimal and the working conditions were challenging. The school was located in a working-class neighborhood where budget cuts had eliminated most arts programming. Sophia's position was funded by a small grant that covered her salary for 20 hours per week, barely enough to qualify as part-time employment. She taught general music classes in a converted storage room with outdated equipment and instruments that were falling apart from years of use by energetic children. Despite the limitations, Sophia genuinely enjoyed working with the students. Many of them had never been exposed to classical music or formal musical instruction, and their enthusiasm reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She taught them to sing simple songs, introduced them to different musical instruments, and occasionally brought her violin to demonstrate what serious musical study could achieve. "Miss Rivers, will you play something for us today?" asked Emma, a precocious 8-year-old who had become particularly interested in the violin after hearing Sophia play several weeks earlier. "I didn't bring my violin today," Sophia replied, setting up the portable keyboard she used for most classes. "But maybe next week I can play something special for you." "Why don't you bring it every day?" Emma persisted. "You're really good at it." Her innocent question cut deeper than Sophia had expected. How could she explain to a child that she had been too discouraged and exhausted to bring her violin to work, that she had begun to think of her musical abilities as irrelevant to her daily life? "Sometimes grown-ups have to focus on different things at different times," she said diplomatically. "But music is always important, even when we can't play as much as we'd like." As she led the children through a lesson on rhythm and tempo, Sophia found herself thinking about Emma's question. Why hadn't she been bringing her violin to school more regularly? The children clearly enjoyed hearing her play, and it would enhance their musical education significantly. She realized that she had been protecting herself from the pain of connecting with her musical identity in a setting that reminded her of everything she had given up. But after the previous evening's performance, that protection no longer felt necessary. If anything, her experience at Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party had reminded her that sharing her musical abilities, even in modest settings, could be deeply rewarding for both herself and her audience. "Miss Rivers," called out Marcus, a 10-year-old who shared her brother's name and had shown genuine interest in learning about different instruments. "Could you teach us to play violin someday?" "Violin is a difficult instrument that requires a lot of practice," Sophia explained. "But if you're really interested, I could show you some basic techniques." The enthusiasm in the children's faces as they discussed the possibility of learning violin reminded Sophia of her own excitement when she had first started studying music. Their eagerness was infectious, and she found herself making mental notes about how she could improve their musical education if she had more resources and flexibility. Her lunch break provided an opportunity to call Charles Morrison's foundation and inquire about their application process. The receptionist was friendly and informative, explaining that they accepted applications on a rolling basis and that Sophia's background would likely make her a strong candidate for their career transition program. The application requires a written statement about your musical goals, 3 professional references, and a recording of 2 contrasting pieces performed within the last 6 months, the receptionist explained. Most applicants also schedule an in-person audition, though we can arrange video auditions for candidates who live outside the metropolitan area. Sophia took notes on the requirements, realizing that she would need to prepare seriously if she wanted to present a competitive application. The recording requirement was particularly challenging, as she hadn't made any professional quality recordings since her student days at Juilliard. Her afternoon classes went smoothly, with the children responding enthusiastically to a lesson about different musical styles from around the world. As she packed up her materials at the end of the school day, Emma approached her with a hand-drawn picture of someone playing violin. "I made this for you," Emma said shyly. "It's supposed to be you playing music for us." The simple crayon drawing showed a stick figure holding what was unmistakably a violin, surrounded by smaller figures with musical notes floating above their heads. Sophia felt unexpectedly emotional looking at the child's artistic interpretation of her teaching. "Thank you, Emma. This is beautiful," she said, carefully folding the picture to take home. "I'll treasure it." "Will you really bring your violin next week?" Emma asked hopefully. "Yes," Sophia said, making a spontaneous decision that felt absolutely right. "I'll bring my violin next week and play something special for the whole class." Her third job of the day was at an upscale Italian restaurant where she worked as a server 4 evenings per week. The money was better than her other positions due to tips, but the work was physically demanding, and the management treated servers as easily replaceable. She had been there for 8 months, long enough to develop efficient routines, but not long enough to feel any particular loyalty to the establishment. The restaurant catered to the same demographic that had attended Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party, wealthy professionals and couples who thought nothing of spending more on a single meal than Sophia typically earned in a day. She had learned to present herself as invisible and efficient, anticipating customers' needs without drawing attention to her own intelligence or background. But tonight felt different. As she tied her server's apron and prepared for the dinner rush, Sophia found herself observing the customers with new eyes. These were people who appreciated quality and were willing to pay for exceptional experiences. The previous evening had shown her that her musical abilities could command respect and significant compensation from exactly this type of clientele. "Table 12 wants to know about wine pairings for their entrees," called out Jessica, another server who had been working there longer than Sophia. "Can you handle that, or should I get Roberto?" Roberto was the sommelier, a pretentious man in his 30s who treated the servers like they were incapable of understanding anything about food or wine. Sophia had learned considerable information about both topics during her months at the restaurant, but she typically deferred to Roberto to avoid potential conflicts. Tonight, however, she felt confident enough to handle the wine pairing question herself. "I can take care of it," she told Jessica, approaching table 12 with a level of self-assurance that felt new and refreshing. The couple at the table had ordered the restaurant's signature osso buco and wanted wine recommendations that would complement the rich flavors of the dish. Sophia suggested a full-bodied Barolo from the restaurant's wine list, explaining how the wine's tannins would balance the richness of the braised meat while enhancing its complex flavors. "Excellent recommendation," the gentleman said after tasting the wine. "You clearly know your wines. Have you worked in restaurants long?" "A few years," Sophia replied diplomatically. "I enjoy learning about food and wine pairings." "Well, you've certainly mastered it," his companion added. "This is a perfect match." As Sophia continued through her shift, she found herself engaging more confidently with customers, making thoughtful recommendations and providing the kind of knowledgeable service that elevated their dining experience. Several tables complimented her expertise, and her tips for the evening were notably higher than usual. The difference wasn't just in her technical knowledge, which had always been adequate. Tonight, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth, who understood that she had valuable skills and insights to offer. The previous evening's performance had reminded her that she was capable of excellence, and that confidence was translating into better performance in all areas of her work. During a brief lull in service, Sophia used her break to call Margaret Chen's office at Carnegie Hall. She reached an assistant who explained the audition process for the Young Artist series and offered to send her detailed information about upcoming opportunities. Ms. Chen mentioned that she heard you perform last evening and was very impressed, the assistant said. She asked me to tell you that we have an opening in our spring series if you're interested in auditioning. Sophia's heart raced at the possibility. A solo recital at Carnegie Hall, even in their smaller viol recital hall, would be a career-defining opportunity that could open doors throughout the classical music world. "I'm very interested," she replied. "What would the audition requirements involve?" "A 30-minute program of contrasting pieces performed from memory," the assistant explained. "The audition would be scheduled for early March, with the performance date in May if you're selected." Sophia calculated quickly. It was currently mid-February, which gave her approximately 3 weeks to prepare an audition program that would need to showcase her abilities at the highest professional level. It was an ambitious timeline, but not impossible if she could organize her schedule to allow for intensive practice. The remainder of her shift passed quickly as she mentally reviewed potential repertoire for a Carnegie Hall audition. She would need pieces that demonstrated both technical brilliance and musical maturity, selections that would set her apart from other young violinists competing for the same opportunity. By the time the restaurant closed at 11, Sophia had earned more in tips than she typically made in a full day at the coffee shop. More importantly, she had spent the evening feeling like herself again, engaging with customers as an intelligent, capable professional, rather than someone who was merely trying to survive until the next paycheck. Walking home through the quiet streets, she reflected on how dramatically her perspective had shifted in just 24 hours. The morning had begun with the same sense of trapped desperation that had defined her life for the past 3 years. But now she carried herself with renewed purpose, energized by possibilities that had seemed impossible just 1 day earlier. She thought about Emma's drawing of her playing violin, about the children's excitement at the prospect of learning music, about the respect she had commanded from Mrs. Whitmore's dinner guests and even from customers at the restaurant. All of these interactions had reminded her that she possessed something valuable that went far beyond her ability to make coffee or serve food. Her small apartment felt different when she entered that night. Instead of a temporary shelter where she was barely managing to survive, it now felt like a launching pad for the next phase of her life. The business cards on her nightstand represented genuine opportunities rather than distant fantasies. Sophia sat at her kitchen table and began making lists. She needed to organize her practice schedule to prepare for auditions while maintaining enough work hours to cover her basic expenses. She needed to research recording equipment or studio's where she could create the high-quality recordings required for various applications. She needed to contact former professors who might be willing to serve as references and to provide guidance as she re-entered the competitive world of professional music. Most immediately, she needed to raise the remaining $1,500 required to secure her apartment, but that no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Mrs. Whitmore's monthly performances would provide steady income, and she was beginning to see other ways that her musical abilities could generate revenue while she built toward larger opportunities. The eviction notice was still taped to her refrigerator, but it no longer filled her with panic. Instead, it served as a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything and how quickly circumstances could change when opportunities aligned with preparation and talent. She opened her violin case and lifted out the instrument that had been her constant companion through years of study and months of neglect. The German violin felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, and she spent a few minutes tuning it carefully and testing its responsiveness. Even this brief interaction with her instrument felt restorative, connecting her with the musical identity she had almost lost during her years of financial struggle. She played a few scales and simple exercises, listening carefully to her intonation and bow technique, assessing what aspects of her playing would need the most attention during her preparation for upcoming auditions. Her technique was rustier than she would have preferred, but the fundamental skills were still intact. Her vibrato needed work, and her finger strength had diminished somewhat. But these were problems that could be addressed through focused practice, rather than fundamental deficiencies that would require months to correct. More importantly, her musical instincts remained sharp. The emotional connection she had felt while performing at Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party hadn't been a fluke or the result of adrenaline. It was the natural expression of years of training, combined with life experiences that had deepened her understanding of music's emotional potential. As she prepared for bed, Sophia found herself thinking about her brother Marcus and the sacrifices she had made to help save his life. She had never regretted those choices, and she wouldn't change them, even knowing how they had derailed her original career plans. But now she was beginning to see that her time away from music hadn't been a complete loss. The young woman who had left Juilliard 3 years earlier had been technically accomplished, but perhaps lacking in the depth of experience that could inform truly meaningful musical interpretation. The person who was now planning her return to professional performance had been shaped by struggle and sacrifice in ways that could only enhance her artistic expression. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was from Mrs. Whitmore's assistant, confirming the date for next month's dinner party and asking if Sophia had any special requirements for the performance setup. The message also mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore had received several inquiries from other members who were interested in booking private performances. This development was encouraging, but also slightly overwhelming. Sophia realized that she might need to start thinking about her musical activities as an actual business, rather than just a series of individual opportunities. If demand for her performances was growing, she would need to establish rates, create contracts, and manage her schedule more systematically. She made a note to research the business aspects of freelance musical performance, another item to add to her growing list of tasks that would help her transition from survival mode to career development. The complexity of rebuilding a professional music career was daunting, but it was the kind of challenge she had been craving after years of simply trying to make ends meet. Before turning off the lights, Sophia looked once more at Emma's crayon drawing of her playing violin. The child's simple artwork somehow captured something essential about the joy and connection that music could create between performer and audience. It reminded her that her musical abilities were not just assets to be monetized or career tools to be leveraged, but gifts that could bring genuine happiness to other people. Tomorrow would bring another early morning at the coffee shop, another day of managing multiple jobs while trying to organize auditions and applications. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sophia fell asleep with a sense of excitement about her future rather than anxiety about her immediate survival. The scared young woman, who had approached the Sterling Reserve just 2 days earlier, was being replaced by someone who remembered her own potential and was ready to fight for the chance to fulfill it. She dreamed of performing on stage at Carnegie Hall, of her brother attending her concert, healthy and proud, of Emma and her other students discovering their own musical talents. But most vivid was the dream of simply playing her violin with the kind of joy and freedom she had felt during her student years, when music had been pure expression rather than a desperate attempt to pay rent. When her alarm sounded at 5:30 the next morning, Sophia woke with energy and purpose rather than the usual dread that had characterized her mornings for months. The day ahead would be filled with the same routine tasks that had defined her recent life. But now, those tasks felt like temporary necessities rather than permanent limitations. She was Sophia Rivers, violinist, and she was ready to reclaim her identity. 3 weeks later, Sophia stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall's Weil Recital Hall, her hands trembling slightly as she held her violin. The audition that had seemed like an impossible dream just weeks earlier was now moments away from becoming reality. She had spent every spare moment preparing, practicing in her tiny apartment until her neighbors complained, borrowing time in practice rooms at local music schools, and slowly rebuilding the technical precision that had once defined her playing. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of transformation. She had quit the coffee shop job, much to Derek's surprise and irritation, and reduced her restaurant shifts to weekend evenings only. Mrs. Whitmore's monthly performance had provided enough financial stability to make these changes possible, and word-of-mouth referrals from that first dinner party had led to 3 additional private performances for other wealthy clients. Each performance had been different from the last, requiring her to adapt her repertoire and presentation to various audiences and venues. She had played chamber music for an intimate gallery opening, provided background music for a corporate reception, and performed a full recital for a philanthropist's birthday celebration. The diversity of these experiences had rebuilt her confidence while providing the practice time she desperately needed. But this audition was different. This was Carnegie Hall, the venue that represented the pinnacle of classical music performance in America. The panel of judges included Margaret Chen, whom she had met at Mrs. Whitmore's dinner party, along with 2 other distinguished musicians whose reputations preceded them throughout the classical music world. Sophia had chosen her audition program carefully, balancing technical display with musical depth. She would open with Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, a piece that showcased both her technical precision and her ability to handle complex polyphonic writing. The middle selection was Brahms's Sonata No. 1 in G major, which would demonstrate her lyrical playing and emotional maturity. She would conclude with Sarasate's Carmen Fantasy, a virtuosic showpiece that would highlight her technical brilliance and stage presence. The program represented nearly 30 minutes of music performed from memory, requiring not only flawless technique, but also the stamina and concentration to maintain high performance standards. Throughout, she had practiced these pieces obsessively, working through every technical challenge until her muscle memory was absolutely reliable. Her preparation had been complicated by the need to continue working while rebuilding her performance skills. There had been days when her fingers were stiff from restaurant work, evenings when she was too exhausted from teaching to practice effectively, and moments when she questioned whether she was attempting too much too quickly. But gradually, her playing had returned to professional standards. The technical skills she had developed during her years at Juilliard had never truly disappeared, only gone dormant under the pressure of survival. With focused practice and renewed dedication, they had emerged stronger and more mature than before. More importantly, her musical interpretation had deepened significantly. The young student who had left Juilliard 3 years earlier had been technically accomplished, but perhaps lacking in emotional depth. The woman preparing to audition at Carnegie Hall had lived through experiences that gave her music genuine emotional weight and authentic expression. "Miss Rivers, you're on in 2 minutes," called the stage manager, a efficient woman in her 50s who managed the backstage area with military precision. Sophia nodded and took several deep breaths, running through her mental preparation routine. She visualized each piece from beginning to end, hearing the music in her mind and feeling her fingers move through the familiar patterns. She had learned this technique during her student years, but it felt more natural and effective now that she had real-world performance experience to draw upon. The audition space was smaller than the main Carnegie Hall, but it still carried the weight of history and tradition that made every performance feel significant. She had visited the hall several times during her student years, attending concerts and masterclasses, but she had never imagined herself performing on its stages. As she walked onto the stage, violin in hand, she saw the three judges seated at a table in the middle of the empty auditorium. Margaret Chen nodded encouragingly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. The other two judges, whom Sophia recognized from their photographs in classical music magazines, watched her with polite attention that revealed nothing about their expectations or preconceptions. "Good morning, Miss Rivers," Margaret Chen said, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "Please introduce yourself and your program, then begin whenever you're ready." Sophia positioned herself at the center of the stage and spoke clearly into the space. "Good morning. My name is Sophia Rivers, and today I'll be performing Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, Brahms's Sonata No. 1 in G major, and Sarasate's Carmen Fantasy." She raised her violin and bow, took a moment to settle into her performance stance, and began the opening of the Bach Partita. The first notes filled the hall with pure, clear tone that immediately established her technical competence and musical sensitivity. The Bach Partita was perhaps the most challenging piece in the violin repertoire, requiring the performer to maintain multiple melodic lines simultaneously while navigating complex technical passages. Sophia had chosen it specifically because it would demonstrate her mastery of the instrument's most demanding techniques, but also because it was music she understood deeply and could interpret with genuine musical insight. As she moved through the partita's 5 movements, she felt her nervousness transform into focused concentration. This was music she had lived with for years, pieces that had shaped her understanding of what the violin could accomplish as both a technical and expressive instrument. Her fingers moved with precision and confidence. Her bow technique was clean and controlled, and her musical phrasing revealed the depth of her interpretive abilities. The judges listened without visible reaction, taking occasional notes but maintaining the poker faces that experienced adjudicators used to avoid influencing performances. Sophia had learned during her student years to ignore audience reactions and focus entirely on her own musical goals, so their neutral expressions didn't disturb her concentration. When she finished the Bach, she paused briefly to retune and prepare for the Brahms Sonata. This piece required a different kind of musical thinking, emphasizing lyrical expression and romantic sensibility rather than the mathematical precision of Baroque counterpoint. It was music that demanded emotional vulnerability and the ability to sustain long melodic lines with expressive warmth. Sophia had connected deeply with this piece during her preparation, finding in its passionate melodies a reflection of her own emotional journey over the past few weeks. The music's alternation between tender lyricism and dramatic intensity mirrored her experience of rediscovering her musical identity while navigating the practical challenges of rebuilding her career. Her performance of the Brahms was perhaps the strongest part of her audition. Her tone was rich and expressive. Her phrasing was mature and thoughtful, and her technical control allowed her to focus entirely on musical communication rather than worrying about mechanical concerns. She felt completely connected to the music, as if the violin was simply an extension of her own voice. During the final movement's climactic passages, she noticed that one of the judges had stopped taking notes and was simply listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine engagement with the performance. This was encouraging, but she maintained her concentration and finished the movement with the same level of intensity and commitment she had brought to the opening. The final piece, Sarasate's Carmen Fantasy, was a complete change of character from the classical and romantic works that had preceded it. This was virtuoso showpiece music, designed to display every aspect of the violinist's technical arsenal while entertaining audiences with familiar melodies from Bizet's opera. Sophia had initially been reluctant to include such an overtly flashy piece in her audition program, preferring to emphasize the more serious classical repertoire that demonstrated her musical depth. But her former professor at Juilliard had advised her that the Carmen fantasy would show a different side of her abilities and prove that she could handle the kind of crowd-pleasing repertoire that would be essential for building a successful solo career. Her performance of the Sarasate was brilliant and confident, showcasing technical skills that had been honed through years of serious study and recent weeks of intensive preparation. The piece's rapid scales, double stops, and artificial harmonics presented no difficulties for her, and she played with the kind of relaxed virtuosity that made even the most challenging passages sound effortless. More importantly, she brought genuine musical personality to what could have been merely a technical display. Her interpretation emphasized the Spanish character of the melodies, the dramatic contrasts between tender and passionate sections, and the playful virtuosity that made the piece entertaining without being shallow. When she finished the final flourish and lowered her violin, the silence in the hall seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then Margaret Chen began speaking, her tone revealing approval that hadn't been evident during the performance itself. "Thank you, Miss Rivers. That was quite impressive. Your technique is excellent, your musical interpretation is mature and thoughtful, and your stage presence is very professional. We particularly appreciated your ability to bring distinct character to each piece, while maintaining consistently high performance standards throughout." One of the other judges, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, whom Sophia recognized as a former concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic, leaned forward in his chair. "Your Bach was especially noteworthy. That partita requires not only technical mastery but also deep musical understanding, and you demonstrated both convincingly. Where did you develop such a mature approach to Baroque interpretation?" "Thank you," Sophia replied. "I studied Bach intensively during my time at Juilliard, but I think my understanding of the music has deepened through life experience. The mathematical precision of Baroque counterpoint speaks to me more now than it did when I was younger." The third judge, a woman in her 50s who served as artistic director for several major music festivals, smiled encouragingly. "We can hear that maturity in your playing. There's an emotional depth to your interpretation that suggests genuine life experience rather than simply academic study." Margaret Chen consulted her notes before continuing. "Miss Rivers, we'd like to offer you a slot in our Young Artists series. We have an opening for a solo recital on May 15th, which would give you approximately 2 months to prepare a full-length program. Are you interested?" Sophia's heart raced as she processed what she was hearing. A solo recital at Carnegie Hall was the kind of opportunity that could launch a serious professional career, the achievement that every classical musician dreamed about throughout their training. "I'm very interested," she managed to say, hoping her voice sounded more composed than she felt. "What would the program requirements be?" 60 to 70 minutes of music with your choice of repertoire. We encourage young artists to create programs that showcase their individual strengths and musical personality. Based on what we've heard today, we trust your judgment about repertoire selection." The practical implications began registering in Sophia's mind. She would need to expand her prepared repertoire significantly, arrange for professional accompaniment where needed, invest in appropriate concert attire, and probably take some time off from her remaining work commitments to prepare adequately. But these were the kinds of challenges she had dreamed about during her years of study. They were problems that arose from opportunity rather than desperation, requirements that would allow her to focus on music rather than simply trying to survive financially. "We'll send you a contract and all the relevant details within the next week," Margaret Chen continued. "This is a significant opportunity, Miss Rivers, and we're excited to include you in the series." As Sophia packed her violin and prepared to leave the hall, she felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun 3 weeks earlier, with a desperate attempt to earn rent money, had culminated in the kind of professional recognition she had thought was permanently beyond her reach. The walk home through Manhattan felt different than any she had taken in the past 3 years. Instead of trudging through streets that reminded her of everything she couldn't afford, She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in the city's cultural landscape. She was no longer a struggling service worker who happened to have musical training. She was a professional musician who was temporarily working other jobs while building her career. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Whitmore, asking if she would be available for another dinner party the following weekend. 6 months ago, such a message would have represented desperately needed income. Now it felt like one of many opportunities that would allow her to maintain financial stability while pursuing her primary career goals. She thought about calling her family to share the news, but decided to wait until she had the formal contract in hand. Her brother Marcus was healthy and finishing his final treatments. Her mother had been able to reduce her work hours as his medical bills decreased. And for the first time in years, the entire family was experiencing stability and hope. But more than external validation or financial security, the Carnegie Hall audition had confirmed something essential about her identity. She was not someone who used to be a musician, who had once shown promise before life intervened. She was a musician who had temporarily been derailed by circumstances, but had never lost the fundamental qualities that made her an artist. The evening light was golden as she approached her apartment building, the same building where she had received an eviction notice just 3 weeks earlier. The same landlord who had been threatening to remove her was now eager to negotiate a new lease, impressed by her improved financial situation and references from wealthy clients. Her small studio apartment looked exactly the same, but it felt completely transformed. Instead of a temporary shelter where she barely managed to survive, it had become the launching pad for the next phase of her career. Her violin case sat in its usual corner, but now it represented possibility rather than painful reminders of abandoned dreams. That evening, she called her former professor at Juilliard to share the news about Carnegie Hall and to ask for guidance about preparing for such a significant performance. Professor Elena Marchetti was delighted to hear from her and impressed by how quickly she had re-established herself in the professional music world. "Sophia, I always knew you had exceptional talent, but I wasn't sure you would find your way back to music after everything you went through. This Carnegie Hall opportunity is well-deserved recognition of abilities that were never really lost, just temporarily set aside." They discussed repertoire options for the recital, practice strategies for preparing such an extensive program, and practical considerations about building a sustainable career as a solo performer. Professor Marchetti offered to work with her on specific technical challenges and to help her connect with other professionals who could support her career development. As she prepared for bed that night, Sophia reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in such a short time. 3 weeks earlier, she had been facing eviction and working multiple jobs just to survive. Tonight, she was planning a solo recital at one of the world's most prestigious concert halls. But the most significant change was internal rather than external. She had rediscovered her identity as a musician, not just someone who had once studied music, but someone for whom music was an essential mode of expression and communication. The confidence and sense of purpose that had characterized her student years had returned, strengthened by life experiences that had deepened her artistic maturity. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Emma's mother, calling to thank her for the special violin performance she had given to the elementary school class that week. Emma had been so inspired by the music that she had asked her parents to find her violin lessons. "She talks about you constantly," Emma's mother explained. "She says she wants to play beautiful music like Miss Rivers. Do you know anyone who teaches violin to children? We'd like to find someone with your kind of passion for music." Sophia found herself offering to teach Emma privately, realizing that working with genuinely interested students could be both financially rewarding and personally satisfying. It would be another source of income that utilized her musical knowledge while she built her performance career. As she ended the call, Sophia understood that her future would involve multiple aspects of musical life rather than just solo performance. She could teach serious students, perform for private events, give public recitals, and perhaps eventually work with orchestras and chamber groups. The diversity of opportunities felt exciting rather than overwhelming. The Carnegie Hall recital would be a milestone rather than a destination, a significant step in rebuilding the career she had thought was lost forever. But more than career advancement, it represented the recovery of an essential part of herself that had been buried under years of financial pressure and family responsibilities. She was Sophia Rivers, violinist, and tomorrow she would begin preparing for the performance of her lifetime. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.